Now, I want to introduce my guest, former British Ministry of Defense UFO Office project leader, Mr. Nick Pope. Hey, Nick, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Shifting the Paradigm. How are you?
I'm great, thanks, and thank you for having me on the show. Good to be here.
You were part of the British government's Ministry of Defense, the MOD, for 21 years, but for 3 years specifically, part of the Secretariat, better known as the UFO desk. Can you tell me what you did?
Sure. Well, I was a civilian employee of the UK Ministry of Defence, so the equivalent of the US DoD, and you get posted to all these different jobs in the course of your career, and I just fell into this bizarre position, which had existed right back till the 50s, where my job was to research and investigate UFOs, to assess the defense implications to the UK, and I guess to drill a little bit deeper into it and say, as well as defense implications, by which we meant potential threats, but opportunities too, whether there was anything, for example, of more general scientific interest. And so that's a job that I did from 1991 to 1994. And as I say, I just fell into it almost by chance because the vacancy was becoming available at almost exactly the same time that I was due for a sideways move. So I had no knowledge of this subject, no prior knowledge, no beliefs really either way. To me, it was just something I was going to do for the next 3 years.
Did you ever ask yourself at any point, what am I doing here?
All the time, yes. I think there was a certain degree of what the heck have I gotten myself into? I think the job, even though, as I mentioned, it had existed since the 50s, it was not that well publicized within the department. And although we weren't literally in the basement, we were on the 8th floor, we were in what I sometimes call a sort of metaphorical basement. I guess, that we did all these things that the Ministry of Defense did in terms of high-level strategic defense policy, whether that was nuclear policy, army staffing levels, main battle tanks, fast jets, and then tucked away in this sort of quiet corner was this office doing UFOs. So yeah, I guess I wondered how it would impact my longer term career prospects doing that, as opposed to, for example, working in the private office of one of the defense ministers or one of the service chiefs, which were the sorts of plum jobs that everyone wanted. But, I hadn't been there too long before I realized that it certainly had its opportunities too, in terms of it being the most kind of eye-opening, mind-opening position that I think I'd ever been in.
Were you privy to reports that would come in from pilots and personnel within the branches of the military there in the UK during your time with the UFO office?
Yes, and it's interesting to draw a comparison. We were closer to the old USAF program, Project Blue Book, than we were to an intelligence program like ATIP, for example, the existence of which was not publicized. So a lot of what we did was public facing, and it's difficult to put percentage figures on it, but I would say 95% of the reports that we got probably came from the public, with the rest from our own people, military personnel, pilots, radar operators, and such like. Inevitably, that led to a bit of difficulty, actually, because we used to always have the debate, should we be focusing more on the pilot reports, the radar operator reports, or should we take a sort of more even-handed approach and say, no, all data are potentially important? And we never really even resolved that. But yeah, we got plenty of pilot and radar reports, and some of them were certainly quite interesting. And by pilots, I'm including not just military pilots, but also commercial airline pilots.
While on the topic of pilots and military personnel, you stated in a BBC article back in 2016 that out of around 12,000 sightings that the program investigated, approximately 5% remained unexplained. Quote, we were particularly interested when UFOs were seen by police officers, military personnel, and pilots, especially if there was some corroboration in terms of radar evidence or films and photos that could be analyzed by our technical staff. So, my question is when looking back now, were you and your team just analyzing data to be filed away even when you came across very controversial reports? Or was it, in your opinion, a real effort on behalf of the British government to find out what was going on behalf of public interest as well as national security implications?
We came up against what I think is the ultimate catch 22 of many government UFO programs that have existed over the years. In other words, you investigate the cases, and so at the end of the investigation, you usually have an absolutely definite answer, or more often than not, something with a reasonably high order of probability. And you categorize these sightings as aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteors, satellites, etc., etc. But then the catch 22 is, what do you do with everything else? And in a sense, the analogy I use, it's a little bit like a police investigation. And your unsolved UFO cases are rather like your unsolved crimes. So there is that question, well, what do we do with it? And I mean, yeah, to one extent, I suppose you could say yes, they almost literally are filed away, because in any investigation that doesn't turn up a definitive answer, you eventually hit the point where you say, well, what else can I do? Now, that's why one of the things that we did was we said that instead of looking at these cases individually, what we needed to do was an intelligence assessment of the phenomenon in its entirety. And so that was a parallel initiative, which eventually evolved after I left, I should say, but evolved into something which is generally known as Project Condign, which was literally our intelligence people, military intelligence, sitting down and saying, well, what do we think we're dealing with here?
With all the information you were exposed to while in office and combing through data, in 1996 you released the book called Open Skies, Closed Minds. Have you had any pushback or warnings from the MOD for anything you've said, or even for pursuing this topic in the public eye?
All my different books had to go through the security clearance process. So I would never dream. I'm not a whistleblower. I take my security oath seriously. It binds me for life, even though I took early retirement from the MOD some years ago, and so I would never want to jeopardize national security by putting something into the public domain that was still classified. So I absolutely played by the rules that all people who've been exposed to classified information should be playing by. In other words, I pre-submitted the manuscript to various people in the United Kingdom, and actually with my later book with the United States too, in parallel, because it touched on US issues. And one or two interesting conversations, I guess, took place, and there was maybe a little bit of back and forward on a couple of things, because I think I'd actually done this job myself. I'd actually, by one of those bizarre coincidences in my Ministry of Defense career, I had actually had a job where I'd done the vetting of other people's manuscripts. So I knew that there was always a temptation to err a little bit too far on the side of caution, and to try and cut out things which frankly weren't classified, but were maybe politically embarrassing. So I knew that really wasn't the letter of the law, and said, hey, come on, people, what do you mean that paragraph has to come out? And as I say, there was a little bit of back and forward, but generally speaking, it was all pretty friendly. And I knew the people, of course. Even after I left the Ministry of Defense, I was going back for Christmas parties. I was still in, I think I still am actually, in their fantasy football team. So it was all reasonably good natured.
Once you've been part of a job for 20 plus years, it becomes a family. Now, for those not familiar with your book from 1996, can you tell us a little bit about it? What made you write it?
I felt that there was a story that had not really been told, or had not been told sufficiently accurately. I think there were all sorts of misperceptions with the media and the public about what we did, and it was rooted in, I don't know, part science fiction, part conspiracy. And I tried to really say we should be flipping the narrative on this, and we should be reframing this as what those of us who looked at it from the inside always knew it to be. In other words, a defense and national security issue, and not some sort of sci-fi conspiracy thing. So that was really what it was about. And I think I managed to upset both the true believers, because I wasn't able to tell them we've got these things hidden away in Air Force hangars somewhere, and the diehard debunkers, because I wasn't able to tell them that it was all nonsense and crazy people. So I, in steering that middle path, maybe, as I say, there was something to upset everyone, which I think it's always a sign you maybe are doing it right.
It's always about taking that middle path, taking the good with the bad, venturing into all topics, which you've done. In 1997, you took a leap into the alien abduction topic with the book The Uninvited. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you found?
Sure, you can't look at UFOs. I would say wherever you are, but certainly in government where we get people reporting their experience. You can't do that without getting some of these close encounter experiences. And I must say they intrigued me. We didn't get that many of them as an overall percentage. I think people were rather reluctant to report to an organization they thought at some level was maybe complicit in some of this, or was certainly helping keep the lid on it. But we got some cases over the years, and I thought, this is truly odd, because I could understand the pilot sightings. I would have data to work with. You can get, firstly, the eyewitness testimony, but more important, corroborative evidence from radar. And as you said in I think your intro, or one of your earlier questions, on occasion, if we had photos and videos that our intelligence community specialists could look at, we had, for example, you could do some measurement and signature intelligence, some MASINT. So there was something with the UFO cases, there was something tangible to get your teeth into. But with these alien abduction, alien contact cases, it was much more nebulous, much more difficult. You were much more dependent on just the eyewitness testimony. And so that took me into the territory of having to think, well, what's going on here? Is this some sort of psychological delusion? Is it a hallucination or something like that? Are some of these people simply fabricating the whole thing? Or are we in the territory really where there isn't a single neat answer to that question, and there are maybe lots of things going on? So really, it was something that intrigued me, and having written a book on UFOs, which did extremely well, frankly, my publisher and my literary agent said, well, why don't you do a follow-up? And that was the logical place to go. So really, I won't, I'm not pretending that I came to any definitive conclusion on it. Really, it was just an overview of the mystery, starting way back in I suppose, well, dawn of time with the folklore, but fast forwarding to the contactees, the abductees, getting into the whole debate about false memory syndrome and all these horrendous stories that we heard in the media in the 80s and the 90s about ritual, satanic childhood abuse, and was that real, or was it just confabulated by the people, when they went to see somebody doing regression hypnosis? So it was a fascinating book to write, for sure. But I'm not, as I say, I'm not going to claim that I solved the mystery.
There are a lot of bizarre stories out there. Can you recall a specific case, either in the book or left out of it, that really shocked you or made you feel uncomfortable when it came to looking into the UFO abduction angle?
Well, it has been a long time since I wrote that book, I confess, sort of, 25 years or something. So I'm somewhat, they all blur into one, which was interesting in itself, because there was a definite formula to some of this. It's like there was a process with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But I don't know that I'd use the phrase disturbed. I mean, I suppose if you literally take these things at face value and buy into the idea that this is some sort of hybridization program with removal of genetic samples and things, then I guess self-evidently that would be disturbing. But to be honest, that's not something that the data really supported. I mean, I can look at the UFO issue, and I can talk about radar and FLIR and MASINT, but with the abduction material, frankly, if I'm being brutally honest about it, it's just a bunch of stories, interesting stories, fascinating and profound if true, but not really supported by something which I think you would say is data and evidence in the same way as we're looking at now, for example, within the US government, when the DoD is looking at the UFO issue, when ODNI is issuing their preliminary assessment.
When you exited your position with the Ministry of Defense and left government service, were you a believer or a skeptic of the UFO mystery, or believed in even a small percentage of it having an extraordinary origin?
It's actually a difficult question, because I don't really believe it in kind of binary terms, like either a skeptic or a believer. I think if it's on a spectrum, I would say that after that particular posting, and when I left the Ministry of Defense, I was higher up towards the believer end of the spectrum. But I think that then somewhat I walked it back a little and became a little bit more cautious and said, well, wait a minute, Occam's razor and such like, let's not get too overexcited about this. And then came 2017, the New York Times, ATIP, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and everything that we've happened since. And I think I've kind of gone a little bit up again on that spectrum. So I bounce around somewhat. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I suppose that's the way it should be. We should all, I think, be data-led on this. And as new things are brought to the table, I think it's incumbent on anyone with an interest in this to look at it and say, well, where does that take us?
With the more data collected, sometimes it fills in the pieces, while other times it leads to more questions. When you are not part of the UFO desk filled with countless questions, what else did you do for the MOD or government service that you can speak of after your 21 years of service?
Well, after I left that particular position, I mean, before, I'd had a bizarre mix of jobs, actually. I'd had one job where I was working alongside the Royal Navy to deconflict them from the oil and gas industry in UK territorial waters. Then I had an Air Force job to do with briefing on personnel issues, and got very heavily involved in, back then, what was a huge issue of whether or not women should be allowed, which they weren't when I started doing this, whether they should be allowed to fly as pilots and navigators in the Air Force. And so I was involved in the review and some of the other work that led to that change in policy. Then I did the UFO job. After the UFO job, I did a financial policy job where, amongst other things, I acted as an interface between the Ministry of Defense and the film and TV industry. And, for example, figuring out the terms under which we would lend or allow the James Bond producers to borrow one of our Navy ships for one of their movies, and a lot of other things too. And then my final position was in defense security, which was involved in military policing and counterterrorism, and led to some interesting, very short little hops over to places like Kosovo and Iraq. Absolutely fascinating. And then I'd reached the grade of acting deputy director, and I then kind of passed the assessment and development center, which would have made that a substantive promotion. But at that point, I thought, you know what? I've done 21 years. If I don't leave now, I'll be here for another 20. And I took the leap.
That's a lot of jobs to be a part of. And after your service, you have been on countless documentaries, TV shows, you've written articles, and a handful of books. For those younger viewers and listeners that have not seen any of that, what are you trying to convey when facing the public with your publications and speaking at events in recent years and going forward? I mean, do you consider yourself a researcher of the topic and the pro-non-human intelligence angle, or a researcher with a more skeptical attitude towards it being something extraordinary?
I think I consider myself more of a communicator on the issue, to be honest. I think I can't really claim now I'm not in government. I can't, with no access to those resources and capabilities, I can't claim that I really do much research and investigation anymore. So I think what I do concentrate on is using my media platform and using the profile that I have to communicate on this issue, to raise awareness, to bring young people to the subject. I mean, I do it right across the range of media. I do one of the things that I really enjoy doing now is acting as consultant and spokesperson on like some Hollywood movies, some TV shows, some video games, viral marketing campaigns where there's a UFO or alien theme. And I do some stuff certainly at the fun end of the spectrum, but then I do serious stuff as well. I mean, I've written for the New York Times. I've written for the BBC News website. I think you quoted one of those articles. And I've recently become involved with the Galileo project as a research affiliate led by Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard to see if I can contribute anything there. So I have my finger, I guess, in a lot of pies, but what I really try and do through the journalism, through the broadcasting, whether it's the fun stuff like Ancient Aliens, or whether it's the more serious stuff like BBC or New York Times, what I really try and do is just bring this issue to people, and not, as I say, what I absolutely hate and would never do is say to people, this is what you should think about it. But what I do say is, but you might want to think about it and then come to your own views, because up until 4 years ago, this subject really did have a sort of stigma attached to it. But now I think people see it through a different lens. They see the pilots speaking out, the radar operators, the intelligence officers who've been involved with these programs. They see senators talking about this, coming out of classified briefings and saying, well, we need to dig deeper into this. They read reports about this on the DoD website, on the ODNI website. And I think if I can do one thing, it's maybe try and cut through some of the noise on this issue. And my goodness, there's a lot. And say to people, well, here's the signal.
You're right. There's a lot of noise and information on this issue, and now more than ever, we're seeing a lot more TV shows covering the topic. On January 7th, Ancient Aliens released a season premiere episode called The Disclosure Event. This is a hot topic right now since 2021 was filled with serious coverage leading up to the UAP report in June. In your mind, what does disclosure now mean to you compared to your efforts in the past? And where do you think this is all going, especially with the new congressional mandated UFO office?
Well, I think the UFO community and to some extent the wider public have a very black and white view of disclosure. It either is or it isn't. And in a lot of people's minds, disclosure is a single event, a sort of my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone announcement, probably from the president in the Oval Office. And I've never thought it's going to be that. I don't think it is that. I think it's a process, and I think we're living through that process now. And some of the things that you mentioned in there, like the new congressional mandate in the new defense bill, that DoD, in tandem with the US intelligence community, really grips this issue in a more robust way than it has ever gripped it before. And what people are now saying is, look, we don't necessarily need to take, in fact, we shouldn't take a conclusion-led view of this, but there is something in our airspace. There is something flying dangerously close to multi-billion-dollar military assets like our aircraft carriers. There is something flying into the restricted airspace around critical national infrastructure sites. And so Congress, both in the Senate and the House, rightly is saying, we need to find out. And for years, just the pop culture baggage of the term UFO, I think, prevented these senators, these congressional representatives from wanting to grip this issue. But now they are, and it's great. What I really love and what I think is hugely important about this is that it's right across the party political divide. So, for example, you can have Marco Rubio talking about this and taking a lead role, and then you can have Kirsten Gillibrand doing the same thing. And I think that's absolutely great, because so much of what's going on in US society right now is, I think, deeply polarized along party political lines. And so UFOs, UAPs, it's a chance to bridge that gap. And what we're seeing is that Republicans, Democrats, but libertarians and people who would consider themselves apolitical are all coming together and saying there's something in our airspace. There seem to be good data suggesting speeds, maneuvers, accelerations, other kind of parameters of operation that seem to go way beyond anything in our inventory. The time is long overdue when we want an answer to the question, what is it and what's it doing? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it something else? Time to find out.
We all want answers, and so many people have questions. I believe now more than ever before. And I think that you have seen this topic escalate since you've been in the public eye for nearly 25 years after you wrote your first book, as I mentioned earlier, Open Skies, Closed Minds in 1996, and just a few years before you left the MOD. In the late 90s and early 2000s, people were still laughing about this topic, yet you pushed through. How has that been for you? I mean, have you found yourself wanting to exit the topic due to frustrations you've had or to any negative reception to your efforts?
No, this topic has never ceased to me to be both interesting and important. Now, I've been incredibly lucky. I've because I've done this from within government, I don't think I have come across the sort of overt laughter and ridicule that some people in the UFO community who have been absolute heroes to this subject over the years, many of whom, of course, no longer with us. This is a struggle that started decades ago, but whether it's people like Donald Kehoe or John Keel or Stanton Friedman or whoever it was, a lot of people. Well, I guess Kehoe, of course, served in the military for a while, but a lot of the people who've been the real heroes of this haven't had the luck that I had, and so had to face criticisms that I was insulated from by virtue of having done this for the Ministry of Defense. That's not to say that I haven't been subject to a few separate conspiracy theories because of that, like, still secretly working for the government on the payroll, blah, blah, blah. But no, generally speaking, I've been lucky. So I've been able to persevere, knowing that this is interesting and important. And now, of course, other voices are coming forward, speaking out, and I'm sure, I don't know whether it'll be sooner or later, but I'm sure eventually I will feel that it's maybe time for me to pass the baton to some of these people who have far more recent experience than I of dealing with this. But that said, as long as I can still contribute in a meaningful way, and I mentioned the Galileo project, of course, what we're now seeing is not just government and the military and the intelligence community gripping this, but science and academia coming in. And if I can do anything to bridge that gap and help bring other people in, that'll be great. So yeah, I've mixed feelings. I think some vindication that after years of perseverance, this is now much more mainstream, but obviously some work still to do, whether it's work that I'm involved with or whether it's work completed by other people coming forward now.
This topic has become more mainstream in the United States, but from your understanding, how does the British public handle and perceive the UFO phenomenon compared to reaction and interest in the United States?
Well, it's interesting, and this was quite surprising and disappointing. I mentioned earlier that I don't really research, but I guess when I actually do journalism in terms of me writing the articles as opposed to being quoted in other people's articles, then I suppose I do ask some questions. And one of the things I found out was that 5 days after the ODNI published their preliminary assessment of UAP on June 25th, 2021, the British Parliament had a short debate about this in the House of Lords. And the Minister of State for the Ministry of Defense stood up and basically said, yes, we are aware of the US report, but no, we, the British government, will not be re-engaging on the UFO issue because in our decades of looking at it, we never found evidence of any threat. And we are convinced and confident that we're looking at the UK's air defense region 24/7. And if a threat emerges, we'll deal with it as and when. So they basically said, no, we're not getting involved. And I thought, well, wait a minute. The US, as the world's preeminent superpower, says in this intelligence assessment that UAP are a safety of flight issue and a potential national security challenge. Shouldn't other Five Eyes nations, and indeed NATO members and other allies, shouldn't those other nations say, well, wait a minute, if the US assessment is potential national security challenge, shouldn't we take a look and at least ask ourselves, how have they made that assessment? What, on the basis of what data have they come to that conclusion? So I said to the Ministry of Defense, look, I'm writing up a story on this, and I'd like to see the briefing that the minister got before she made this announcement that they're not going to re-engage. And it was surprisingly scant in its details, but the bombshell revelation that I got was that the US government, the UK government had not seen the classified report. They'd only seen the same 9-page unclassified summary that ODNI put on their website. So I said, come on, people. And my follow-up question, which is still in the system, is, well, has anyone asked for it and been told, no, you can't have it? And if not, will you now undertake to go and ask for it, given that they've said potential national security challenge? So yeah, the situation in the UK is disturbing, because it's not as if civil and military pilots in the UK aren't having these self-same encounters. I don't know that they're quite having them on the scale of something like the Tic Tac incident, but I guess we wouldn't really know.
You're right. Global air safety and security should, in and of itself, force governments across the world to keep a UFO monitoring and reporting office in place. There was an article you shared on Twitter written on December 22nd stating that the UK Parliament does not want to reopen the UFO desk, which closed in 2009 after operating for nearly 50 years. What do you think the reason is for that, especially given the seriousness the topic is getting in the United States?
Well, it's a sort of reverse reason. I mentioned this sort of statement that no threat has emerged from UFOs in 50 years. So that's their reason, as opposed to, let's take a look at particularly the classified data that the US has been looking at for the last few years on this. So that's why I think the UK's position, if it is a fair reflection of the reality, is disappointing. And I'm working both publicly, but also a little bit behind the scenes. I'm working to try and nudge things along a little bit. But absolutely, this is. I think it's a blinkered view. It's essentially saying there are data out there that the US government have, but we, the UK government, are not interested. We've just convinced ourselves that there's no threat from these things. And of course, I would remind them that in military terms, threat is defined as capability times intent. And when you look at the capability of UAP that's been reported, the data look pretty impressive. In other words, if you're doing that equation, it's a very high value for capability.
That is an interesting way to look at the word threat. Now, compared to other countries, the United States is taking a rather unprecedented public approach when it comes to the UFO topic in recent months. Do you think in time other countries will follow? And why, based on your knowledge, is it all coming out now? The interest, the acknowledgement of ATIP, the public announcement of a new UAP office, using the word extraterrestrial in one of the biggest gatherings in 2021, Our Future in Space. Why is this all happening now? Or do you think maybe it's a distraction?
Well, I think it's events-led. And I think there's no getting away from the fact that there have been a momentous series of events, whether it's the UAP sightings themselves and the US Navy videos that everyone's seen, whether it's the intelligence assessment or the preliminary assessment that was done, whether it's the DOD's new office that they're going to set up. And I think what's happened is that a lot of people in Congress, but also in the mainstream media, have said to themselves, wait a minute, you told us this was all just crazy stuff. And now we learn all this has been going on. And that's why I think whether it's the Times, the Post, Politico, some of the deep specialist defense and aviation journals, now those sorts of people are looking at this with fresh eyes. And, there's the old saying, I think more generally, it has its roots in economics, but the old saying that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. I think the United States has looked at this, and it won't have escaped the notice of a lot of other nations that there's been such a center of gravity building up with the effort here in the US. And other political leadership in China, in Russia, but elsewhere will be saying, they'll be turning to their their military chiefs and saying, what the heck is going on in the US? Why are they suddenly reversing 80 years of denial and downplaying on this issue and really going at it all guns? Is it, as you say, is it a distraction operation? Is it an intelligence op where it's actually a cover for something else? Or don't they know what it is? Is it us? Is it, so all these questions will have been asked, but I have no doubt that as I say, it won't have escaped the notice of most other nations that the US has flipped the narrative on this. And when someone flips the narrative so dramatically, the obvious question is why? What's happened? What do they know that we don't know? And what should we do about it?
Your last statement was that we know that we don't know. And that is by far one of my favorite quotes. But the more we talk about it, and I think that the more mainstream it becomes, our ignorance of the topic will change. In September of 2021, you were a guest on a TV show hosted by Peacock called Unidentified with Demi Lovato. That show was very much geared towards her audience that ranges from teens to people in their early 20s that may not know anything about the topic. What were your thoughts on the show and being a part of it?
Well, it was a great opportunity. As I say, I've done media things right across the spectrum, and I've certainly done the sort of stuffy end of the spectrum, if I can call it that. So to get involved with someone who is such an icon for youth, and to work with Demi and to be involved with that show, because I think Demi's reach is I mean, I don't know, I haven't looked on Twitter, but I think it's millions. So it is bringing this to a new audience. And, you're always going to upset people. You're always going to upset people who say, oh, come on, then this is the real pop culture end of the spectrum. But I say absolutely. And that's why I'm doing it. So it was great to meet Demi and be involved in that show. I'm thinking that, I've also, I think I've been on Keisha's podcast and done quite a lot of other things. I've just come back from a gathering of like tech people and others where Grimes played a sort of secret set. So when I get the chance to bring this to a new audience, whether it's a younger audience, a different audience, I say bring it on. And I'll always get criticism for some of this stuff. People will say, well, you should be sticking to the really serious data on this. Well, if you can do a TV show with someone who has millions of Twitter followers, you immediately get the message to those people in a way that if you write an op-ed for a newspaper, then I don't know, it's a different beast, shall we say. Well, it depends on the newspaper, obviously, but a lot of these things, they're very here and gone, and maybe that's the throwaway nature of culture more generally, but I love the opportunity to go new places, meet new people, bring this to new audiences. Bring it on.
You mentioned being on Kesha's podcast. So overall, do you think that today's youth, Gen Zoomers, millennials, and onward are properly being exposed to the topic? Or what do you think we could do to amplify exposure to the topic to younger people?
It's that is a tough and interesting and important question, because, and I'm probably the wrong person to ask it. I'm probably, it's like, oh, who's this old guy come to tell us about this? But I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it is about new media. So we need to look at social media, for example, and say what new social media platforms should people be on? How can that bring it? What, when I do talk to young people about this, though, the interesting thing is you might say, well, how do we convince them about this? My response is, at one level, there's no need. A lot of them don't need convincing. It's like, oh yeah, the aliens, yeah, the UFO videos, yeah, seen that, yeah, fine. So there's an acceptance there already. I think it's how you leverage that, how you weaponize it with the people back in Congress. And I think, as I say, that may be about social media platforms. It may be about celebrity endorsement and influencers. It may be about video gaming. It may be about all the kind of tech things that are coming, whether it's blockchain or crypto and non-fungible tokens and all that kind of new language that people of my generation are having to learn. I mean, the answers are going to be somewhere in that mix, I think.
For many, you would be classified as a celebrity, or at least a person that would value your opinion on the topic. So, what is the most important thing that you've learned during these decades of being involved that you would like to share?
I think it's the fact that we can have all the theories and the case files and the photos and the videos that we like, but in the end, it's probably science that's going to crack this mystery open, because in one sense, to be universally accepted, I think this is going to have to conform to the scientific method. And that's why I think Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard is very important with this and a key figure. And I don't think it's an accident that he was one of the people invited, for example, to the Washington Cathedral event alongside Bill Nelson and Avril Haines, for example, because I think it's going to be leaders in the field of science like Avi Loeb that are going to be critical. I think the other thing, and it's kind of allied to your question, but it's a different side of it, and I think it's the bringing in of the private sector. So, you could say that governments had nearly 80 years of leading on this and managing it and maybe not doing a very good job of it. What I see now is that it's about to be wrested out of the hands of government, firstly by people, some of the billionaires who are active in and interested in space, like Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos. But it's going to be in parallel with them, all the other Silicon Valley giants, all the other tech company CEOs, the venture capitalists, the hedge fund people, and again, we're back. It's you might say it's a small pool at the billionaire level. I mean, it's all these people, whether it's Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Jeff Bezos, but it's all the other. It's the younger people coming up, starting these amazing companies that just can suddenly explode from nowhere and are going to be literally world leaders in a year or two in whatever field it is. And so it's getting those people involved in this subject and interested in this subject. I mean, every time Elon Musk tweets about UFOs, whether it's serious or lighthearted, everyone's like, wow. And there are tens of thousands of follow-up comments. But it's probably going back to your question about the most important thing. I think the most important thing is that, as critical as what's going on in the DoD and the intelligence community is right now, it's what's going on in the scientific community and in the business community that may just turn out to be more important.
Changing topic a bit, have you looked into what is going on in the case of Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, where you have UFOs crossing paths with paranormal and supernatural events? What are your thoughts and insights on this specifically?
Well, I'll confess, I've never visited Skinwalker Ranch. I've obviously talked talked to a lot of people who have, people like Travis Taylor. I've read the new book by James Lukatsky, George Knapp, and Colm Kelleher. I think obviously that raises some very interesting questions, still unresolved, still kind of even not getting a clear line on it from DOD. It raises some interesting questions about the dividing line between ATIP and ORSAP, and how what those people were doing tied in to, the maybe more military focused work that people like Lou and Chris are doing, and whether that's back in the day or now trying to move this forward with Congress and with others. So all I can really say is I'm following the debate with interest. I don't know what the connections are going to turn out to be between these phenomena, but I often speculate, and it is just speculation, that we miss a trick by pigeonholing all this too narrowly and saying that's UFOs, that's paranormal, that's telekinetic. A lot of these are just words. These are the labels that we put onto something that we don't yet fully understand. So who knows whether or not we're putting the labels quite in the right place, or whether the descriptions are entirely accurate. So yeah, very long-winded way of saying I'm watching with interest, and I'm going to be fascinated to see how it all falls out.
I believe watching how it will all evolve may express how open we are to the history, but also the future aspects of the UFO phenomenon. Can you name some smoking gun cases from over the years, either in the UK, USA, or other countries that you feel really deserve more attention, where you suspect the truth is being obscured and that may contain irrefutable proof of an extraordinary explanation in the UFO mystery?
Well, I think people have heard of many of the big cases that I think are important. The Rendlesham Forest incident from the UK, the Nimitz Tic Tac incident from 2004, some of the East Coast sightings involving the US Navy more recently, the Cash Landrum encounter in again 1980, the Cosford incident, which was a UK case, 1993, the Belgian Triangle Wave in March 1990, the Hest Island Lights, which seem to be very long lasting in terms of something that you could really get and study over years. That's from Norway. The list goes on and on. Ray Bowyer's sighting over the UK Channel Islands, the Channel Islands that lie between the UK and France in, I think that was 2006, the Chicago O'Hare case. I mean, that's a very brief, and wow, you caught me off guard with that. So I'm sure I've missed a lot of big ones that I'll say, oh, why didn't I mention that? But those are a few that have caught my eye over the years, some of which in the UK I've obviously been involved in looking at personally. The Calvine incident from Scotland, 1990, another one that's got a lot of interest on it. So yeah, there's a lot. But I think in terms of the smoking gun, who knows? The smoking gun may be a case that the media and the public hasn't yet heard of. I mean, really, no one outside a very small circle of people in the system had heard of the Nimitz Tic Tac incident until it exploded into public awareness via the New York Times and others at the end of 2017. So what other smoking guns might there be out there? And who knows how they'll come out? Will it be a whistleblower? Will it be a Freedom of Information Act request? Will it be the government itself proactively releasing something, or will something just happen in real time that will be captured, by the world's media at some big event? I don't know.
You brought up the Hest Island Lights. What is your theory concerning that ongoing case?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think it's it's indicative, I think, of the fact that there might not be one single neat answer to the UFO phenomenon. And I would differentiate. And I think this is important because I think something like that, there is probably a link with geology and plate tectonics and pressures under the Earth's surface. Earthquake lights is a phrase that has often been used in relation to this, but ball lightning. We don't really understand where the boundary is between Earth lights, earthquake lights, ball lightning, the sort of exotic atmospheric plasma phenomena that Project Condign, the Ministry of Defense study that I mentioned, flirted with the idea that this might explain some of it. As I say, I don't think any of this delivers one there it is answer to the UFO mystery. I don't think there is. That was one of the important things the ODNI report said. Look, don't expect a single answer to this. So I think Hess-Darlan might point us to a more conventional, I'm not for a moment suggesting that's extraterrestrial, and it doesn't seem to be, in terms of the objects themselves, of the order of size and structure that we see with some of the big cases like Belgium 1990 or Hudson Valley in the 80s. But it's interesting, and I think it's yet another reason why science should be looking at this. And actually, one of the first questions when people say scientists should be more involved, my response is, but which scientists do you mean? Because I think there are a lot of people that could bring something to the table on this. And on Hess-Darlan, maybe it's geologists.
You mentioned the Nimitz encounter, so now I have to ask you, given all the cases you looked into while in the UK UFO office, when in 2017 you saw the videos of the Tic Tac, the Gimbal, and the Go Fast UFOs, did they remind you of any specific cases you looked into back during the days of your MOD investigations? And if so, can you share one of those with us?
Well, we certainly had. I mean, when I saw those videos, I was put in mind of the fact that we in the Ministry of Defense had at some point, I think the official line from the Ministry of Defense is that they were on old film that hasn't survived. I know a lot of people are skeptical of that for something this important, but it does happen. I mean, it's amazing how much we don't have from the Second World War, when we were arguably facing a global existential threat, and so things do get lost. But as I say, in the 50s, in the 60s, the Royal Air Force had a series of close encounters with UFOs, and occasionally there was gun camera footage there. So when I saw the US Navy videos, I was reminded of that. And I think I have seen some of those videos over the years. But to be honest, it really didn't tell me anything. This was footage from the 50s. It was so grainy and blurry, and the people doing the briefing or showing the films, I don't think they had any of the data. And in fact, in terms of MASINT, I'm not sure what data we actually had in the first place back in the day. A pilot chasing a UFO and getting a grainy shot, which we were looking at literally on 8mm cine film, which at some stage I think got transferred to VHS video cassettes, but it was just a blur, a dot. But it reminded me of that, and which is in one way, I think, as important though the US Navy videos are, it's not as if military pilots seeing and chasing and sometimes filming UFOs is a new phenomenon. It isn't. And as important and interesting as those three best known US Navy videos are, this is again one of my kind of hobby horses with all this. Let's not bet the farm on just three videos, because what if, despite all the people saying no, it couldn't be, Russia or China, and it's not our own black project tech. We've checked, we'd know. What if it does unravel? What if there's a sort of oops, it was us moment with something? So even if you think that's a vanishingly small probability, I never think it's smart to bet the farm on a single thing, or in this case, 3 linked things. So yeah, it's important that we look at that, but it's important that we look at the data holistically.
I like that. Don't bet the farm analogy. In 1999, you wrote a book called Operation Thunderchild. Can you share with us what that book is about?
Yes. Well, that was quite fun, actually. I'd written my first book on UFOs and my second view on the alien abduction mystery, essentially just overviews of the phenomenon, albeit seen from a sort of government insider perspective, particularly with the first book. Then I think I sat down with my literary agent and with my publisher, and we all said, where should you go next? What should you look at? And I think there was some talk of crop circles, but I didn't feel there was enough material, and I wasn't personally convinced enough that there was really anything to that. I was really at the skeptical end of the dial on that one. So I said, what I'd really like to do is write a sci-fi novel, but write it in a sort of Tom Clancy techno thriller way, where I blend it with all the real bits of hardware and all the real world kind of strategy, doctrine, tactics. So you could almost, and Operation Thunderchild and the sequel, Operation Lightning Strike, it was just a sort of what if couple of novels about alien invasion where I said, Hollywood's had its say. What do I think, having sat where I sat? What if we faced an unknown threat that we did gradually begin to realize was extraterrestrial? What might happen? How would SecDef look at this? How would the chairman of the Joint Chiefs look at it? How would the Air Force respond? But in the UK, so using the UK positions, and that's what those books were. And I should say that even those 2 sci-fi novels, because I was writing through that lens, had to go through that same security clearance process. But I enjoyed writing them. It was more fun writing those, in a sense. And a more recent thriller that I've written called Blood Brothers, which has nothing to do with UFOs and aliens. It's just about special forces and intelligence officers going after terrorists. So again, I've enjoyed writing those books maybe more than the nonfiction, but they all had to go through security clearance.
It is interesting to hear that even your science fiction books had to go through a security clearance. But out of all the books you've written and documentaries you've been a part of, if you could recommend one of each as a primer for my younger audience who are just getting into this topic, which book and documentary would you recommend, and where could it be located online?
I think for the book, I would say Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, because it's the most recent of my nonfiction books. So it leverages the fact that the UK government has declassified and released a lot of my old case files, which really freed me up to talk about this in a way that I couldn't perhaps in some of my previous books. So Encounter in Rendlesham Forest talks about a single case, but it puts it in the context of the wider phenomenon. So that's the book. In terms of the TV series, I would say The Basement Office, because I sat down with Stephen Greenstreet, a filmmaker and journalist at the New York Post, and we did a totally counterintuitive thing in that most UFO shows these days have really high production values. If you look at a show, which I love, by the way, like Ancient Aliens, it's all kind of drone shots and recreations and fabulous locations, and it's great. The Basement Office is just two guys sitting at a desk in a basement talking about UFOs. So you'd think it doesn't work, but you put those episodes up and they're all free on YouTube, and they get like, some of them get like 2 million views. So yeah, The Basement Office is a great sort of TV show that people can watch for free on YouTube and elsewhere.
Nick, thank you for being with us here today on Shifting the Paradigm.